Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
My wife Rana and I just came back from the Ambrosetti Forum in Lake Como. And boy, oh boy, was it gloomy. You know, people talking about the crisis in Italy and the crisis of the Eurozone and Greece and all of the financial machinations that we all know too well. Now, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I want to suggest that there is a ray of silver lining in that what happened in the financial markets has happened time and time again. I'm an American, so my history, who lives in Canada, my history doesn't go back as far as yours, but from what I know, in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, we had one of these financial speculative run-ups. And then we had another one in the Great Depression and the crash of 1929, and another one. And then we had the crash of 2008. And one of the things I've been able to do is to take a long, hard look at these periods. I wrote a book about it. It's called The Great Reset, not the topic of tonight. It's about creativity. But in that book, The Great Reset, looking back over these periods of crises, I found that they opened up two pathways for new rounds of growth and prosperity. First, they stimulate tremendous rounds of innovation. Huge periods of innovation and the creation of new technologies. The period of the 1880s, both in this country and in the United States and in Germany, was one of the greatest outbursts of innovation in human history. And according to the great historian Alexander Fields, the 1930s, although beset by financial trauma, was the single most technologically progressive era of the 20th century, far outdistancing the tech boom of the 1990s and early 2000s. And when you think about it, how do we really create wealth in our societies? How do we really build prosperity? What is this august institution really about? It's not about moving money around and speculating wildly in the stock market or financial derivatives or even on housing and homes. It's about taking the one real source of economic wealth that we have. All of us share it. We see it in one another. We see it in our children and grandchildren. We see it in every little boy and girl. It's the only real source of wealth that human beings have. It's the thing that distinguishes us from every other species. It's our ability to harness our own creativity, to leverage the creativity of others, and to come together in great conurbations of cities and urban areas like this one, London, and to put our creativity to use to build new technologies, to build new enterprises, to build new public goods, to build new ways of living. And that's why, in a nutshell, I say creativity is our new economy. And it's something we have to harness, we have to cultivate, we have to take great care of. I would submit to you, and I want to encourage you to think about this not only tonight, but through this week and as you go through your deliberations, that in fact, we are living through a very auspicious time. And a time, although we'll have to struggle to rebuild, we'll have to struggle for quite a while because these periods of crisis and reset are generational events. But we are living through the greatest moment of economic transformation in all of human history. That's what I want to share with you. If you look back through all heretofore history, and you look at the way human beings created wealth, for most of that history, we worked hard on the land, we settled near river deltas, we tilled the soil, we built wealth by harnessing raw materials. And then, with the great industrial revolution that the classical economist Adam Smith, Karl Marx, in your own museum, wrote about, we took an additional source of wealth, the wealth that comes from human physical labor, and we combined raw material and human physical labor. The economists called it the three great factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Land, labor, and capital. We combined raw materials, natural resources, with masses of physical labor streaming off the countryside and into the cities in the United States, where my grandparents migrated from the southernmost tip of Italy, part of those great migrations into the booming industrial centers of the world. But for all that time, it was physical assets, natural resources, physical labor that created our great wealth, built our societies, created great cities, industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, in the north of this country, all throughout the so-called Rust Belt or Middle Belt of the United States. But then over the course of the past 20 or 30 years, something changed. The world was beset by globalization. We saw the rise of what economists call new competitors. They give it a funny name. They call it the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. New competitors with using technology and mobilizing billions of people to engage in physical labor caused our countries, for a time, to experience deindustrialization. In the United States, the percent of people in the blue-collar working class, which at one point was over 60% of the population, has dropped to less than 20%. And a startling statistic I present in my new book, The Rise of the Creative Class Revisited: 6% of the workforce in the United States is engaged in directly making things. But our economies have continued to grow. Our economies have continued to innovate. But we've added a new force of production, or we've cultivated a force we've all had for a long time. We've cultivated and brought it to the fore. And many people have speculated on this great economic transformation. Some called it the rise of an information age, a cybernetic age, a digital economy, a technology age, a post-industrial future, the rise of a service economy. And the great Peter Drucker said that we lived in a time of a knowledge economy, in a knowledge society. Now, all of those theories capture important elements of the transformation we're going through, but I would submit to you, I have submitted to you, that there is something more basic and fundamental. There is something more basic and fundamental to human existence in our economy that goes deeper into what makes us human, that goes deeper into what differentiates us as a species, than even when those great classical economists talked about physical labor. It was physical labor, our ability to make things out of physical labor, that made humankind more productive than other species. It's not the information or the technologies we create. It's not the services we provide. It's not the knowledge that's poured into our heads. The thing that distinguishes human beings and binds us together intersubjectively as a whole is our shared human creativity. It's not a knowledge economy or an information economy or even a post-industrial economy. It's the rise of a new creative economy over the past 2 or 3 decades that distinguishes our time. Now, it wasn't an easy transition. And those of us like me old enough to remember the 1950s, or perhaps the 1960s right here in London, will remember it was an interesting time, the rise of new kinds of music, the rise of new kinds of fashion and design, Carnaby Street, the rise of the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, interesting, an American musician who comes to London and teams with 2 British mates to create his new. It was almost as if a giant temper tantrum was occurring in our society as we began to adjust. But beginning in the 1980s, the rise of the creative economy starts its enormous takeoff. In the United States alone, in that time, more than 20 million new jobs, 20 million new jobs were added in this creative sector of the economy. It is not just arts and cultural creativity that stimulates this transformation. It's the application of creativity in the fields of science and technology. The great high technology revolution, from semiconducting to computing to software to the new biotechnologies to the social media, and the application of creativity in all of the great professions of business and management, education, research, healthcare, and the law. Now, in the United States, where I live, or in Canada, where I teach, roughly a third of the population is engaged directly in creative production. That's up from 5% at the turn of the last century. It's up from 10% in 1950 to a third of the workforce today. In the United Kingdom, more than 40% of your workforce, amongst the highest in the advanced world. Only the Northern European and Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Singapore, are higher, in the range of 45 to almost 50%. Places like San Francisco, 45 or 46%. Manhattan in New York City, 40%. London itself, 42%. The eastern part of this city, which is going through an incredible transformation. According to the recent report from the Center for London, more than 3,000 new digital firms operating at the cutting edge of creativity, creating 50,000 jobs. 55% of the workforce in the creative economy. In the west of London, one of the highest figures in the world, nearly 7 in 10 workers are already members of this creative class. It is this creative force I write about in my book that is changing everything, from the way we work to the way we live to the application and rise of whole new industries. Now, some people hear this and they get a little bit skeptical. And they begin to think, and if you look at events that have happened in London, if you look at events that have happened in New York, they begin to think that perhaps creativity is a little bit elitist. That it is creating a creative elite that is leaving the masses behind. And it is true. It is true that our societies are becoming terribly unequal and divided by class. But I want you to know that creativity is not only our greatest resource, it is something that each and every one of us share. And I need to let you know where I learned this. My earliest studies were studies of manufacturing. And I went and visited all the great manufacturing plants of the United States Midwest and Upper Canada. I toured all through England and Wales, local firms, foreign firms, Japanese car plants. I went all through the continent of Europe and all through Asia. I came to one factory in Japan where I met the plant manager, and he told me something that I will never forget. He said, "Professor Florida, we're going to win the Industrial Revolution. The reason is not because your workforce is subpar. It's because you have an outmoded management model," and I teach in a business school. He said, "You believe the source of innovation and of business growth lies with the CEO and the business elite and the R&D scientists and engineers." He said, "We know better. The real source of economic growth comes from the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people who man our factories and our suppliers' factories." And then when I was writing my book, I reflected where I really learned this. I learned this from my father. My father's name was Louis Florida. He was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants. My dad was born, became a teenager in the heart of the Great Depression. He left school in Newark, New Jersey at age 13, put his books down on his desk to take up work in a factory. My grandfather worked in the factory, his older brother worked in his factory, my grandmother worked in a bakery, and his 6 siblings. It took 9 people to make one family supporting wage. My dad then, on the day Pearl Harbor was attacked, put his tools down in the factory, enlisted in the U.S. Army, fought alongside great British soldiers, stormed the beaches at Normandy, fought in all the great battles of World War II, and he came back and he went to work in the same factory. When I was a young boy, I wanted to see what my dad did, and I've always been fascinated by factories and technologies. And I begged my father to take me to the factory. They made eyeglasses that looked just like this. They made metal glasses and plastic glasses. And my dad would relent. First he would say, "No, you can't come to the factory. It's your job. I work in the factory, so you don't have to. It's your job to go to school." But I would cause a tantrum. I would cause a ruckus, to be quite candid. And he would relent on Saturdays when the plant was running overtime. I would enter that factory with the machines whirring and buzzing, and I would sit studying the machines. And my dad would tap me on the shoulder and he said, "Richard, it's not the machines that make this factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people who work here." You see, that's what we've forgotten. Every single human being is creative. That's the resource we have. That's the resource we must stoke. And sometimes we forget that. We think only special people are creative. Only great artists or musicians, great scientists are creative. But creativity is an intersubjective and a social process. In the academe, what do we say? We all stand on the shoulders of giants. We work together and we draw on the past to create new ideas. So with building our new economy based on creativity. And it is our task and our challenge, especially those of us who are blessed and advantaged, to actively work and stoke. Imagine if 4 in 10 people in this country have the great good fortune to work in the creative economy. If 6 or 7 in 10 in London do, if a third in the United States do, imagine what would happen if we could expand that from 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 to 80 to 90 and more percent. Well, I have one other thing to share with you, and it's the subject of much of my work. If the industrial corporation, well, if the farm was the economic and social organizing unit of the agricultural age, if the great industrial corporation which built our societies was the economic and social organizing unit of my father's time, the great industrial age, we have a new economic and social organizing unit of our time. You can feel it. You can see it in the renaissance of this great city. You can see it in the resurgence of Manhattan. You can see it in the resurgence of great global cities in Asia. You know, it's the city itself. Our cities and communities are the social and economic organizing unit of the creative age. They are supplanting and complementing the role played in previous epochs by our great corporations. When people look at this shift, they get confused. They see our world has become technology. Our world has become global. We have gone through a period of globalization. And even the great writers and the economists said we have reached the end of geography, the death of distance. Thomas Friedman, in a book, said the world has become flat. Place is no longer important. It is certainly true that for some standard things, they can be moved offshore and globalized. But the reality is that place has become increasingly important. Our communities, our neighborhoods, and our cities have become more important than in any other time in human history. In just the past few years, the world crossed an incredible historic milestone. For the first time in human history, 50% of the entirety of the world's population live in cities and urban areas. According to the United Nations, that will increase to 70% by the year 2050. If you take just the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the world, London, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, they produce more than 50% of our entire economic output. I've looked long and hard at this. We built new data on the cities and great regions of the world because that data doesn't exist. We actually extracted it from the satellite images of the world at night. We're able to organize that data into the true economic units that power our world economy. It is not corporations, and it is no longer nation states. It is great conurbations, bigger even than individual cities. In the United States, it's the corridor, centered in New York, but which runs south to Washington, D.C., and north to Boston. 50 million people, $2 trillion in economic output. In this area of the world, it is the area of London stretching to Leeds and Manchester. $1.2 trillion in economic output. It is not India and China that are great competitors. It is the Mumbai-Bangalore axis, the Beijing-Shanghai corridor, the world's 40 largest mega regions, and there are more than 200 countries in the world economy, account for more than 2/3 of our entire economic output and 9 in 10 of our innovations. The world isn't flat, it's clustered, it's concentrated, And it's spiky, and it's becoming spikier and spikier and more clustered. As we globalize, we not only spread, we become concentrated. Now, I wasn't the first person to figure this out. In fact, the person who figured it out, who I need to share with you, was a woman who's now deceased, became a dear friend and mentor to me. Didn't have a PhD, didn't go to graduate school, didn't teach at university. Her name was Jane Jacobs. She was born in the easternmost part of Pennsylvania in Scranton, left to work at Architectural Forum in New York, where she began to observe the transformation of cities. And in her great books, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, The Economy of Cities, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, she made what she said was a very humble discovery. And as she told me when we spoke and as she wrote in her book, she said, I think I made a discovery that most other economists missed. She said, if you look at the great work of Adam Smith, the greatest of the classical economists, and you look at his chronicles of the pin factory and the deepening division of labor, he pointed out that what powered economic growth was our ability to divide and subdivide tasks into their most elemental components. This is what Frederick Taylor picked up on with his stopwatch. Henry Ford added the assembly line. But she said, if you subdivide and divide further tasks into their most elemental component, and you make a division of labor more robust, you will get more efficiency. But what truly drives growth is not efficiency, it's innovation. And innovation comes not from companies, it may occur in companies, it comes from our communities and our cities. She had a great case study of this woman in New York who invented, of all things, the brassiere. And she invented the brassiere. She was a dressmaker in order to fit her customers' garments. So she knew a fabric manufacturer, an elastic manufacturer, and a hooks manufacturer. And she could combine and recombine. Just like Stephen Jobs didn't invent the personal computer. He went to Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in the Silicon Valley, and he combined and recombined components. Well, you've had your own history of creativity and innovation here. I remember meeting with one of your cabinet secretaries once, and he was talking about technology innovation and what it would take for England, United Kingdom, to build a technology. And I said, you had one of the greatest creative industries of all time in rock and roll music. Combining and recombining sounds, combining and recombining fashion. We study the music industry. We consider it one of the canaries in the coal mine of the knowledge economy. It's a market in miniature. Jack White of the White Stripes, when they asked him what makes a great center of musical innovation, like London or Liverpool or Detroit or wherever, he said it's the same thing that Stephen Jobs says about technology. It's the ability of very talented people to combine and recombine, reconfigure themselves and invent new sounds. Many of our great musicians, including Jimi Hendrix, invented new technology. Your own Jim Marshall, inventing a new series of amplification devices for people like Pete Townsend of The Who or Jimi Hendrix to create new sounds and new sonic identities. It is this ability of cities, from music to arts, to culture, to entertainment, to media, to technology. And you know, my colleague said, well, Richard, that's not true of technology. Technology occurs in suburban office parks. Technology does not nestle in great cities. They had a word for it. The Nerdistan, where the nerdy engineer goes. The Nerdistan, where technology would happen. Well, what's happened in the past decade? Look at the rise of East London and Tech City. Who could have ever imagined? Look at what's happening in Berlin after the wall came down and the artists moved in, and now Twitter, the social media company, has chosen it for its European headquarters. I looked at the statistics today for you. The Silicon Valley, the birthplace of high technology industry, the mecca for science and engineering. Oh yes, it still has a lot of venture capital investment. It gets about $6 billion. But the inner city of San Francisco, for the first time, gets more, $8.5 billion. Manhattan has become the third largest center of venture capital financed high technology in all of America. And Washington, D.C. in the center, and Chicago. And Los Angeles, around Venice and Santa Monica, are catching up. It took a while. The automobile caused us to decentralize. The suburbs grew and provided cheap space. And it looked for a while like maybe arts and culture was in the city, but now technology is back too. Our cities are our single greatest innovation. They are truly humankind's greatest flourishing of our capacity to innovate and create. When Robert Lucas accepted his Nobel Prize in economics, he had an essay he called The Mechanics of Economic Development. He said, I will be devoting this essay to Jane Jacobs, who showed us what is really the mechanism of economic growth. The real mechanism of economic growth is as people come together in cities, we combine our creative talents, we leverage each other's skill, and we build more and more wealth. Which leads me to my concluding remark in our challenge. I read in your own paper today, the Financial Times, about the property boom in London. In Miami, they said in the Financial Times today, property values since 1995, including the crash, have risen 64%. In Manhattan, the Financial Times reported today, property values, including the crash and the bubble bursting, have increased double. In London, depending on the metric you use, whether you're counting in pounds or dollars, it's between 3 and 4 times. And they said, of course, that London, like New York, was becoming a city where some Britons lived and many people from the world economy lived. It was becoming a global city. I built maps of this, of many of the great global cities in the world. As creativity has become the motor force of production, the creative class has prospered. Do you know in the United States, for the members of the creative class, the great good fortune, the researchers, the technologists, the artists, the musicians, the journalists, the educators, the rate of unemployment has never crossed 5% in the Great Crisis, while the workers and blue-collar workers, their unemployment rate, 10, 15, 20. The mayor of Detroit said in Detroit, the unemployment rate was over 50%. Our cities are becoming more divided. I wrote in the Financial Times about this. Our cities are becoming more divided, but it doesn't have to be that way. You see, every great crisis and period of transformation, we appear to be divided. It happened in the Depression. Oh, and then there was organizing, and there was rioting, and there were revolutionary movements, and it happened in the 1880s, the rise of socialism and communism. But we're smart. You see, our task is we can't prosper with just a creative elite. We need to dig down deep. We need to recognize that every single human being is creative. And that's what I call the new social compact. We need a new social compact. We need a new social contract. And the social contract can't be limited to the old social compact of the industrial era, where he provided housing and public supports and public goods, made sure people weren't destitutely poor. Of course, that was a big step forward, pioneered in Europe. The United States came to that late with Franklin Roosevelt. We need a new social compact that recognizes the creativity that it lies deep within everyone, that harnesses that creativity, that invests in that creativity, that makes sure it's just a terrible waste. Every wasted element of human creativity is a terrible waste, and one that is centered in our cities. Our new economic rebuilding plan can no longer be a top-down national effort. It can no longer be a corporate-led effort. We talked at Ambrosetti about this. If we want an economic strategy, if we want an industrial rebuilding strategy, if we want an economic and technological strategy of the future, it has to be rooted in building and rebuilding our cities. I thank you for your patience in listening to me. I look forward to our dialogue, and most of all, I look forward to your questions.